The snow fell silently over Camp Concordia, white flakes drifting through floodlight beams as the supply truck's engine rumbled to a halt outside the quartermaster's office. Captain James Donovan stamped his boots on the wooden steps, clipboard in hand, his breath visible in the Kansas winter air. The prisoners watched from their barracks windows as crates were unloaded, wooden boxes stamped with familiar military markings, but also cardboard cartons bearing unfamiliar logos and colors. Among them, stacks of brown packages that would soon become the subject of whispered conversations throughout the camp. None of the German prisoners, still adjusting to the shock of capture and transport across the Atlantic, could have imagined that a simple chocolate bar would become the symbol of everything they had been told was impossible about America. Donovan checked items off his inventory list: standard rations, medical supplies, cigarettes, and 5,000 Hershey's chocolate bars, allocated as part of the standard prisoner supplement. To him, it was merely another delivery. To the men behind the barbed wire, it would become something far more profound. As the guards carried boxes toward the supply buildings, a light snow dusting their shoulders, one prisoner turned to another and asked quietly, "What kind of nation feeds its enemies chocolate?" The journey to this moment had begun months earlier on the battlefields of North Africa, Italy, and France. Oberleutnant Kurt Hoffmann had surrendered with his remaining men outside Anzio after their position had been overwhelmed by American forces. The humiliation of capture had been profound, but what followed had defied everything he'd been told to expect. Instead of execution or brutal camps, they had been processed efficiently, given medical treatment, and transported to America on troop ships that, while crowded, provided regular meals and protection from the elements. Hoffmann had spent the crossing in a state of constant tension, waiting for the cruelty to begin. He had grown up hearing stories of how Americans treated their enemies: savagery disguised as justice, starvation disguised as discipline. The Reich's newspapers had painted vivid pictures of degenerates who would torture prisoners for sport, a mongrel nation incapable of civilization or mercy. Yet hour after hour, day after day, these expected horrors failed to materialize. When they reached American shores, the prisoners were loaded onto trains bound for camps across the country. Hoffmann found himself headed for Camp Concordia in Kansas, established in a former college campus and surrounded by endless fields of wheat and corn. The barracks were simple but solid, with beds, blankets, and stoves for heat. After months in the freezing Italian mud, even these basic accommodations seemed luxurious. The German prisoners moved through those first days in a state of wary confusion, expecting at any moment for the conditions to deteriorate, for the true nature of American captivity to reveal itself. But the routine that emerged was bewildering in its orderliness. Roll calls, work details, 3 meals daily in a mess hall that served portions larger than what they'd received in their own army. Some whispered that it was all for show, a temporary deception that would soon give way to reality. Others remained silent, uncertain what to believe as their expectations collided with experience. It was during the second week of captivity that the first chocolate bars appeared in the mess hall. Sergeant Werner Kleinschmidt, a former baker from Dresden, stood in line for his evening meal when the American server dropped something brown and wrapped in paper onto his tray alongside the usual bread and stew. Werner stared at it, puzzled. "Was ist das?" he asked, pointing. The American server, a young private from Ohio, smiled. "Hershey's," he said simply. "Chocolate." The word rippled through the line. Chocolate? In a prison camp? In Germany, chocolate had disappeared from shops years ago, reserved for high-ranking officers or party officials, a luxury that ordinary citizens had almost forgotten existed. Now it was being handed out casually, as though it were as common as bread. Werner carried the bar back to his table, unwrapping it with careful fingers, as though it might disintegrate at his touch. The rich smell rose to meet him, sweet and impossibly decadent. The first bite melted on his tongue, triggering memories of peacetime Christmases and birthdays long past. Around him, other prisoners experienced the same revelation, the taste cutting through years of propaganda and privation like a knife. That night, as the barracks lights dimmed, the conversations began. Hoffman overheard fragments as he moved between bunks, checking on his men as he had done at the front. "My children haven't tasted chocolate in 3 years," one soldier whispered. "And here they give it to us, prisoners, as if it were nothing." Another voice responded, "In Berlin, they told us Americans were starving, that their factories had failed." Silence followed, heavy with the weight of contradiction. What other lies had they been told? What other truths awaited them in this strange captivity that offered chocolate to enemies? The questions lingered in the darkness, but answers would come only with time and further discoveries beyond the barbed wire. The chocolate bars appeared with mechanical regularity. Twice weekly in the mess hall, additional pieces included in Red Cross packages. By the end of the first month, the initial shock had faded somewhat, replaced by an awkward expectation. The prisoners began to notice patterns in distribution, differences in wrappers, varieties they hadn't known existed. Milk chocolate, almond bars, crackle with crispy rice. An entire taxonomy of sweets that had vanished from German civilian life years earlier now appeared routinely in an enemy prison camp. The American guards seemed amused by the prisoners' fascination, occasionally trading chocolate for hand-carved trinkets or sketches, despite regulations prohibiting such exchanges. To them, Hershey bars were commonplace, as ordinary as cigarettes or chewing gum. This casual attitude toward what had become precious luxury in Europe only deepened the cognitive dissonance the German prisoners experienced. Feldwebel Heinrich Schröder, who had commanded a machine gun squad in Sicily before his capture, kept a small notebook hidden in his mattress. In it, he recorded observations about camp life, not military information, but personal reflections he hoped someday to share with his family in Hamburg. One entry from February 1944 read, "Today they gave us chocolate again. The guards call it Hershey's and seem surprised when we treat it as special. I asked Private Miller how they could spare such luxury for prisoners. He looked confused and said it was standard issue for all American soldiers in the field." Standard issue? In Germany, my children write that they haven't seen chocolate since 1941. What kind of nation feeds its soldiers, and even its prisoners, what we cannot provide for our own children? This question echoed through the camp as winter gave way to spring. The American practice of treating chocolate as an ordinary ration rather than a rare luxury forced the prisoners to confront uncomfortable realities about the war they had been fighting. If America could produce enough chocolate to distribute it casually to prisoners of war, what did that reveal about their industrial capacity, about their supply chains, about the fundamental differences between the two nations now locked in conflict? Even more troubling was the realization that the apparent prosperity they witnessed contradicted everything they had been told about the enemy. The mental gymnastics required to reconcile these contradictions left many in a state of quiet crisis, their convictions undermined not by propaganda or lectures, but by the simple reality of a chocolate bar in their hands. As spring warmed the Kansas plains, work details took the prisoners beyond the camp boundaries to local farms, where they helped with planting and maintenance under guard. These excursions provided glimpses of American civilian life that compounded their confusion. Farmhouses with electricity and indoor plumbing stood where German propaganda had described rural poverty. Cars and tractors operated despite years of war, their fuel tanks full when German civilians had long since abandoned their vehicles for lack of gasoline. Most striking were the children they sometimes saw, well-fed, well-clothed, with cheeks full and healthy, where European children had grown gaunt. And these same children often munched on the very chocolate bars that prisoners received as rations, treating them as everyday snacks rather than rare treasures. Dr. Emil Brauer, once a chemistry professor at Heidelberg before being drafted into military service, found himself deeply troubled by what he observed. During one farm detail, he watched as an American boy, perhaps 10 years old, casually discarded half a chocolate bar because he didn't want the nuts it contained. The sight of such waste, of something that would have been fought over in Germany, shook him profoundly. That evening, back at the camp, he spoke quietly with Hoffman. "We were told they were primitive, undisciplined," he said, "but what I see is abundance beyond imagination. Even their waste speaks of strength we cannot match." Hoffman nodded, his expression guarded. "Be careful with such thoughts," he warned. "Remember your duty, even here." But his words lacked conviction, for he too had begun to question the foundations upon which his beliefs had been built. The spring thaw brought another revelation that widened the growing fissure in the prisoner's worldview. A delivery truck arrived at camp bearing crates of new clothing, shirts, trousers, underwear, and socks for all prisoners. The quality of these items exceeded what many had worn even before the war. Clean, durable fabric with strong stitching replaced the threadbare uniforms they had surrendered in. Corporal Max Schultz, a former tailor from Munich, ran his fingers over the weave of his new shirt with professional appreciation. "Better than what we had at the front," he admitted to those nearby. "The Reich has been rationing cloth for years. Here they dress prisoners better than our civilians." The clothing, like the chocolate, represented not just material comfort, but a disturbing implication. America's productive capacity so far exceeded Germany's that even its prisoners received what would be considered luxuries in the fatherland. As summer approached, the chocolate became a form of currency within the camp's informal economy. Prisoners who received additional bars and packages saved them to trade for cigarettes, better work assignments, or small privileges. Some even sent bars home in letters, knowing the rarity and value they would hold for families in Germany. The American authorities allowed this practice, seemingly unaware of how profoundly symbolic these small brown rectangles had become. Each bar that crossed the Atlantic carried with it not just sweetness, but doubt, a physical contradiction of everything the Reich had claimed about American capacity and conditions. Dietrich Weber, a young infantryman captured in the Ardennes, wrote to his mother in Dusseldorf, "The chocolate I've enclosed comes from our regular rations. The Americans give it to us twice weekly, without special occasion. Please share it with Elise and the children. Perhaps when you taste it, you will understand what I cannot fully explain in words about this place." Inside the camp, the summer heat brought new routines. Prisoners were permitted to create gardens, organize sporting events, and establish a small library. The normality of existence behind barbed wire contrasted sharply with the chaos they knew their families faced back home. Letters arriving from Germany spoke of intensified bombing, food shortages, and displaced civilians crowding the roads. Yet here in Kansas, prisoners ate 3 meals daily, received medical care, and even enjoyed occasional treats like ice cream or cake in the mess hall. The cognitive dissonance grew more acute with each passing week, a psychological burden that manifested in different ways. Some prisoners doubled down on their ideological convictions, insisting that what they witnessed was exceptional or temporary. Others withdrew into silence, processing privately the contradictions between what they had believed and what they now experienced. And some began to speak more openly, questioning not just the specific claims of propaganda, but the entire framework of the conflict. Lieutenant Karl Meyer, an artillery officer who had surrendered in France, found himself increasingly troubled by the gap between expectation and reality. "We were told that America was a paper tiger," he confided to Hoffman one evening as they watched a baseball game organized between barracks. "That its industry was crippled by strikes, its army undermanned and poorly equipped, its people soft and divided. Yet I see no evidence of weakness here. Only strength, so secure it can afford generosity even to enemies." Hoffman frowned, uncomfortable with such talk, yet unable to dismiss it entirely. The evidence surrounded them daily, in the camp's construction and maintenance, in the guards' equipment and demeanor, and yes, in the chocolate bars that appeared with such reliable abundance that prisoners had begun to expect them as a right rather than a luxury. By midsummer, a new dimension had been added to the chocolate phenomenon. Camp administrators had established a small commissary where prisoners could purchase additional items with credits earned through work. Among the offerings were various American candies and confections, not just Hershey's bars, but M&M's, Baby Ruth bars, and other sweets that had disappeared from European shelves years earlier. The sight of these colorful packages, arranged casually on shelves as though scarcity were an alien concept, drove home the fundamental asymmetry of the conflict in ways that military briefings never could. This was not merely about chocolate anymore, but about the industrial might and material abundance that allowed such production to continue unabated even in wartime. One prisoner was overheard remarking, "If they can spare sugar and cocoa for candies while we cannot fuel our tanks, how did we ever think to win?" The question lingered, unspoken but ever present, in the minds of men who had once believed victory was inevitable. If America's abundance extended to such luxuries for prisoners, what resources must they be directing toward the war effort itself? Rumors circulated about the factories the work details had glimpsed. Massive facilities running day and night, producing aircraft, vehicles, and weapons in quantities that seemed impossible. The chocolate bars became symbolic shorthand for this realization, physical evidence of a productive capacity that dwarfed anything the prisoners had known. When Private Schmidt savored his Hershey bar after dinner, he wasn't just enjoying a sweet treat. He was confronting, consciously or not, the fundamental miscalculation that had brought him to this strange captivity. By autumn, as heartbreaking news from Europe filtered through in letters and official bulletins, the mood in the camp darkened. German cities were being systematically destroyed by bombing. The Russian advance pushed relentlessly westward, and supplies for civilians had been reduced to desperate levels. Amidst this grim reality, the contrast of American abundance grew ever more painful to acknowledge. Dr. Brauer, receiving a letter that described his teenage children scavenging for food in Berlin, found himself unable to finish the Hershey bar he had saved from his rations. He placed it on his bunk, staring at it as tears filled his eyes. "They tell me my son is eating soup made from potato peels," he whispered to no one in particular, "while I am offered chocolate as though it were nothing." The weight of this inequality, not just in comfort but in fundamental necessities, became a moral burden for many prisoners, a source of shame and confusion that transcended their status as enemies. Toward winter, as temperatures dropped and snow once again covered the Kansas plains, Christmas preparations began in the camp. American authorities, following Geneva Convention guidelines but exceeding them in many respects, arranged special meals, allowed decorations, and even planned a small gift distribution for the prisoners. Hoffman, still struggling with his own conflicted feelings, was called to the commandant's office to discuss the arrangements. Captain Richardson, the camp's administrator, sat behind his desk reviewing papers when Hoffman entered and saluted. "At ease, Lieutenant," Richardson said. "I wanted to inform you about the Christmas provisions for your men." He slid a sheet across the desk. The menu for Christmas dinner included turkey, potatoes, cranberry sauce, and pie. At the bottom was a notation, "Special ration, 1 quarter-pound Hershey bar per prisoner." Hoffman stared at the paper, something breaking inside him. "Sir," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "may I ask a question?" Richardson nodded. "Why do you give us such things? Chocolate, good food, warm barracks. We are your enemies." The American captain looked genuinely surprised. "Because that's how prisoners should be treated," he said simply. "It's the decent thing to do. And frankly, we can afford it." The last words hung in the air between them, loaded with implication. We can afford it. 4 words that contained within them the entire story of the war's inevitable conclusion. Hoffman saluted again and turned to leave, but Richardson called after him. "Lieutenant, is there something wrong with the chocolate? Several of your men have been saving it rather than eating it." Hoffman paused at the door. "No, sir," he replied. "There's nothing wrong with it. But in Germany, many of our families haven't seen chocolate in years. It has become meaningful to us in ways you might not understand." Richardson's expression shifted as understanding dawned. "I see," he said quietly. "I hadn't considered that." This brief exchange revealed the vast gulf of experience between captor and captive. One for whom chocolate was commonplace, the other for whom it had become laden with complex emotions and implications. As Hoffman returned to the barracks, he reflected on how thoroughly his perspective had shifted since capture. The enemy he had been trained to hate and fear now appeared in a different light entirely. Not because of propaganda or indoctrination, but because of direct experience. And ironically, because of something as simple as a chocolate bar. Christmas in Camp Concordia brought a temporary suspension of the psychological tensions that had built throughout the year. The mess hall was decorated with pine branches and paper stars, carols were permitted, and the promised feast materialized exactly as described. Each prisoner received their quarter-pound Hershey bar, larger than the usual ration, with their meal. Many saved it, wrapping it carefully in paper to preserve it. Some sent it home in their next letters, others kept it as a tangible reminder of this strange Christmas in captivity. Werner Kleinschmidt, the baker, had been permitted to help prepare desserts for the holiday meal. As he worked alongside American cooks, he was startled by the casual way they measured ingredients, sugar, butter, chocolate, that had become precious rarities in Germany. One cook noticed his expression as a 5-pound bag of sugar was opened. "Something wrong?" he asked. Werner shook his head. "In my bakery in Dresden, I had to close in 1942 because there was no more sugar, no chocolate, no butter. Here you have so much." The American cook shrugged. "We cut back some, but there's still plenty, more being made every day." That night, Werner lay awake thinking about those words, more being made every day. While Germany's resources dwindled to nothing, America's factories continued to produce not just weapons, but cake and candy. The implications were too painful to fully contemplate. As 1945 began, news of the war's progression became increasingly dire for the German prisoners. The Western Allies were pushing toward the Rhine, the Russians continued their advance from the east, and German civilians were fleeing westward in massive numbers. Letters from home grew sporadic and desperate, describing conditions that contrasted ever more sharply with the relative comfort of the camp. Yet even as this news filtered in, the routine distributions continued unchanged: food, clothing, cigarettes, and yes, chocolate. This stability in the face of global chaos was perhaps the most disorienting aspect of captivity. While their homeland crumbled and their families struggled to survive, the prisoners found themselves in an artificial bubble of normalcy. Their basic needs met with mechanical efficiency by the very enemy they had been taught to despise. The emotional impact of this contradiction manifested in various ways. Some prisoners withdrew into themselves, unable to reconcile what they knew of home with what they experienced in captivity. Others expressed anger at the American guards, a displaced rage born not of mistreatment but of the unbearable inequality between their conditions and those of their loved ones. Still others began to openly question the foundations of the conflict, speaking in whispers about the lies they had been told, the miscalculations of their leaders, and the futility of a war against a nation whose material abundance seemed limitless. Dr. Brouwer, the chemistry professor, became increasingly vocal in his analysis. "It's not merely about resources," he explained to a small group gathered in the barracks one evening. "It's about systems. Their factories continue to produce because their cities remain intact. Their transportation networks function. Their farms operate normally. While he left the sentence unfinished, but everyone understood. The strategic bombing campaign had systematically destroyed German infrastructure, creating cascading failures that affected everything from military production to civilian food supplies. Captain Donovan, overseeing a work detail in late February, observed a scene that illustrated how profoundly the prisoners' perspective had shifted. A supply truck had arrived at the farm where they were working, delivering goods to the American family that owned the property. Among the items unloaded were several boxes of Hershey bars, purchased casually along with other groceries. One of the prisoners, watching from the field where he was repairing a fence, turned to another and said something that made both men laugh bitterly. Donovan, curious, approached them. "What's so amusing?" he asked. The prisoner, an older man named Fisher, who had once been a schoolteacher in Cologne, hesitated before answering. "I said that we are losing this war not because of tactics or courage, but because of chocolate." Donovan frowned, confused. "Chocolate?" Fisher nodded, his expression serious despite the seeming absurdity of his statement. "Yes, Captain. The fact that you can produce so much chocolate, that even now, in the 4th year of war, your children eat it daily and your prisoners receive it in rations, this tells the whole story. We are fighting a nation that can feed its enemies better than we can feed our families. How could we ever have won such a war? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Donovan had no response that wouldn't sound like gloating, so he simply nodded and moved on. But Fisher's observation crystallized what many prisoners had come to understand during their time in America. The chocolate bars that had initially shocked them had become a lens through which they viewed the entire conflict, a symbol of the fundamental asymmetry between the combatants, not just in military power, but in basic productive capacity. The Reich might have launched the war with superior tactics and training, but America fought it with an industrial might that could sustain both guns and butter, both bombs and chocolate bars, in quantities that made eventual victory all but inevitable. As spring returned to Kansas, bringing with it news of Germany's collapsing defenses and the Allied push into the heartland of the Reich, the mood in Camp Concordia shifted again. The chocolate rations continued unchanged, but now they carried yet another layer of meaning. For many prisoners, they had become symbols not just of American abundance, but of the life that awaited after the war. Some began to save their bars not to send home, but to preserve for the future, a small taste of what peace might offer when the fighting finally stopped. Others developed elaborate rituals around their consumption, breaking off tiny pieces to savor slowly, making each bar last as long as possible. The chocolate had transcended its physical reality to become something almost talismanic, a promise of normality in a world gone mad. When news of Hitler's death reached the camp on May 1st, the reaction was subdued. There were no celebrations among the guards, no taunting or triumphalism. For the prisoners, the moment brought a complex mix of emotions: relief, despair, uncertainty, and for some, a quiet acknowledgement that what they had begun to suspect months earlier had finally been confirmed. The war had been unwinnable from the start. As they gathered in small groups throughout the day, processing the news and contemplating what it meant for their future, many found themselves holding or consuming their chocolate rations. It was, in its way, a communion, a shared experience that bound them together in this moment of transition. The sweet taste carried echoes of childhood, of peacetime, of a world before ideology had consumed everything. When Germany's formal surrender came days later, the camp administration organized a special meal for the prisoners. Not a celebration, but an acknowledgement of the momentous shift in their status. No longer were they enemies in an active conflict, but survivors of a concluded one. The meal included the usual Hershey bars, but also a chocolate cake prepared by the mess staff. A gesture that might have seemed trivial in another context, but carried profound significance here. As the men ate in silence, contemplating their uncertain future, the taste of chocolate mingled with thoughts of home, family, and rebuilding. What would they find upon return? Would there be anything left to salvage from the ruins? And how would they explain what they had learned in this strange captivity, where enemies had treated them with a humanity their own leaders had failed to show? In the weeks that followed, as repatriation plans were developed, many prisoners began to collect and preserve evidence of their American experience. Some pressed chocolate wrappers between pages of books. Others sketched the camp and its routines. Still others wrote detailed accounts of what they had witnessed. They knew that what they had seen contradicted everything their families had been told, and they wanted tangible proof to share upon return. Karl Meyer, the artillery officer who had questioned propaganda claims, approached Captain Richardson with an unusual request. "Sir," he said, standing at attention, "when we return to Germany, I would like to take with me one thing that truly represents America." Richardson raised an eyebrow. "And what would that be, Lieutenant?" Meyer's expression remained serious. "A box of Hershey bars, sir, not for myself, but to show my countrymen what I have learned here." Richardson considered the request, then nodded slowly. "I think that can be arranged." As summer progressed and prisoners began to be processed for return to Europe, many carried with them not just memories, but physical reminders of their time in America. Among these, chocolate wrappers and bars featured prominently, not for their taste or value, but for their meaning. They had become artifacts of a revelation, physical proof of a truth that many in devastated Germany would find difficult to accept. that the enemy had possessed such abundance that even prisoners ate what had become luxury at home. This knowledge would shape the returning men in ways they could not yet fully appreciate, influencing their participation in post-war reconstruction and their perspective on the emerging Cold War. The lessons of the chocolate bar about industrial capacity, material priorities, and the fundamental nature of modern conflict would linger long after its sweetness had faded. When the last transport prepared to leave Camp Concordia in late summer, Captain Donovan stood at the gate checking names against his clipboard. The prisoners filed past, carrying their meager possessions and the weight of everything they had learned. As Hoffman approached, Donovan noticed him slip something into his pocket, a Hershey wrapper, carefully preserved. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them. No words were necessary. The chocolate had said everything that needed to be said about victory and defeat, about propaganda and reality, about the quiet revelations that come not through violence, but through the mundane contradictions of daily life. As the trucks pulled away, carrying men forever changed by their American captivity, Donovan reflected on Fisher's observation months earlier. Perhaps the schoolteacher had been right. Perhaps the war had indeed been decided not by bullets or bombs, but by chocolate bars, by the vast industrial machine that could produce such abundance even while fighting across two oceans. And perhaps the most powerful weapon in that conflict had not been destruction, but the simple, devastating truth that one society could provide what another could not. In years to come, when former prisoners gathered to remember their time in America, the conversations inevitably turned to the chocolate. Not because it had been the most important aspect of captivity, but because it had been the most revealing. The small, sweet contradiction that had cracked open larger truths about the world they thought they knew. In kitchens and cafes across a rebuilding Germany, they would sometimes pull out saved wrappers or even unopened bars, now faded and brittle with age, to show children and grandchildren. This, they would say, is how I learned that what we are told is not always what is. This is how I discovered that abundance, not scarcity, is the true measure of strength. And in those quiet moments of recollection, the taste would return, not just of chocolate, but of revelation in the most unexpected of places, behind barbed wire in the hands of the enemy.